They were told American soldiers were monsters who would burn their villages, steal their food, and leave children to starve in the streets. But when 8-year-old Klaus peered through the rubble of his destroyed home in Munich on April 30, 1945, the enemy didn't arrive with fire and fury. They arrived with something far more dangerous to everything he'd been taught. Chocolate bars, medical supplies, and smiles that made no sense to a child raised on propaganda. Klaus expected violence. Instead, he got a soldier named Tommy who knelt down, offered him a Hershey's bar, and asked in broken German if he was hurt. By the third day of American occupation, whispers had started among the children hiding in the ruins. These aren't the demons we were told about. What happened next would shatter everything an entire generation believed about enemies, about Americans, and about the nature of war itself. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These true accounts from World War II reveal the humanity that survived beneath the horror of conflict. The morning mist hung over the ruins of Munich like a gray shroud, turning the destroyed city into something that looked more like a graveyard than a place where people had once lived. The American tanks rolled through the streets slowly, their treads crushing broken glass and scattered bricks. The sound echoed off the skeletal remains of buildings, a mechanical heartbeat in a dead world. Hidden in basements, under staircases, and behind piles of rubble, dozens of children watched the liberators arrive. They ranged in age from 5 to 16, survivors of a war that had consumed everything they knew. Most were orphans now, their parents killed in bombing raids or lost somewhere in the chaos of a collapsing empire. They wore torn clothes, their faces dirty, their eyes hollow from months of hunger and fear. Klaus Brenner, 8 years old, crouched behind what had once been his family's kitchen wall. His blonde hair was matted with dust, and his ribs showed through his thin shirt. He clutched a small wooden horse, the only toy he'd managed to save when the bombs fell. His parents had disappeared 3 weeks ago during the last air raid. Since then, he'd been living on scraps and rainwater, hiding from the chaos above. The propaganda speakers had been silent for days now, but Klaus could still hear their words echoing in his memory. The Americans are savage barbarians. They will show no mercy to civilians. They will steal from children and leave them to die. Death is better than capture by the American demons. As the tanks passed by his hiding spot, Klaus saw soldiers walking alongside them. Big men in olive green uniforms, carrying rifles and heavy packs. Their faces were hard to see under their helmets, but they moved with purpose, scanning the ruins, calling out in English words Klaus didn't understand. One soldier stopped near Klaus's hiding place. He was young, maybe 20, with kind eyes visible beneath his helmet. He carried himself differently than the others, not with the swagger Klaus expected from conquerors, but with something that looked almost like caution, maybe even sadness. The soldier's name was Tommy Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa who'd been drafted 2 years earlier and had fought his way across Europe. He'd seen too much death, too much destruction. As he looked at the ruined city, he wasn't thinking about victory or conquest. He was thinking about the children who must be hiding somewhere in this devastation. Tommy pulled a chocolate bar from his pack, a Hershey's bar, standard issue for American soldiers. He'd been saving it for days, not because he was particularly hungry, but because something told him he might need it for something more important than his own appetite. He knelt down near the rubble where Klaus was hiding and called out softly in the few German words he'd learned. Kinder? Children? Keine Angst. No fear. Klaus pressed himself deeper into his hiding spot, his heart hammering. The soldier was right there, close enough to touch. This was it. This was when the Americans would show their true nature. But Tommy didn't search aggressively. He didn't shout or threaten. Instead, he placed the chocolate bar on a broken brick where any hidden child could see it, then stepped back several feet. He sat down on another piece of rubble and waited, his rifle set aside, his hands empty and visible. Klaus stared at the chocolate bar. He hadn't seen real chocolate in over a year. His stomach cramped with hunger just looking at it. But this had to be a trap. The Americans were trying to lure him out so they could, what? Kill him? Capture him? He'd been told so many terrible stories. Minutes passed. Tommy continued to sit quietly, occasionally glancing around but making no threatening moves. He pulled out a photograph and looked at it, a picture of his own family back in Iowa. His little sister was about Klaus's age. Finally, hunger won over fear. Klaus crept forward, ready to grab the chocolate and run. But as his small hand closed around the bar, Tommy spoke again. "Hey there, buddy." The words were gentle, almost whispered. Klaus froze, expecting the worst. Instead, Tommy smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a predatory grin, but the kind of smile Klaus remembered his father giving him before the war destroyed everything. It was a smile that said, "You're safe. I won't hurt you." Klaus had been prepared for many things, but not for kindness from a supposed monster. The liberation that confused everything. Within hours of the first American troops entering Munich, word spread through the hidden networks of surviving children that something unprecedented was happening. The Americans weren't behaving like conquerors. They weren't acting like the demons described in the propaganda. Instead of seizing food supplies, they were distributing them. Instead of commandeering the few remaining habitable buildings for themselves, they were setting up medical stations and refugee centers. Instead of treating civilians as enemies, they were treating them as human beings in need of help. Private Tommy Mitchell became part of a squad assigned to search for survivors, particularly children who might be hiding in the ruins. It was dangerous work, booby traps, unstable buildings, and the constant possibility of resistance fighters. But Tommy approached it with a patience that surprised even his fellow soldiers. He developed techniques for coaxing hidden children into the open. Chocolate was effective, but so were small toys, medical supplies, and simple patience. Tommy would sit near suspected hiding places and wait, sometimes for hours, until curiosity or desperation overcame fear. Each child who emerged told a similar story. They'd been taught that Americans were monsters, but the reality was completely different. The soldiers shared their rations, provided medical care, and showed a gentleness that contradicted everything the children had been told. Klaus became one of Tommy's regular contacts. After that first encounter with the chocolate bar, the boy began appearing more frequently, always cautious but gradually more trusting. Tommy learned a few more German words, and Klaus picked up some English. They communicated mostly through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the universal language of kindness. Tommy discovered that Klaus was living in the basement of a bombed-out school with 7 other children, the youngest only 4 years old. They'd formed a small family unit, sharing whatever food they could scavenge and protecting each other from the dangers of a war-torn city. When Tommy brought this information to his commanding officer, Captain James Rodriguez, the response was immediate. The American unit set up a temporary children's shelter in one of the less damaged buildings, staffing it with medics and volunteers. But getting the children to trust the shelter required more than just providing space. It required breaking through months of propaganda and fear. And that's where soldiers like Tommy became crucial, not as warriors, but as bridges between enemies who were discovering they weren't enemies at all. The chocolate that changed minds. The power of small gestures became apparent within the first week of American occupation. Klaus, emboldened by his positive experiences with Tommy, began bringing other children to meet the Americans. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: initial terror, gradual curiosity, and finally amazement at the kindness they encountered. Greta, a 12-year-old girl who'd been caring for her 6-year-old brother since their parents died, was convinced that Americans would separate families. Instead, when she finally approached the temporary shelter with her brother in tow, the soldiers went out of their way to ensure the siblings could stay together. Hans, a 14-year-old who'd been living alone for months, was certain that Americans would force him into slave labor. Instead, they offered him food, medical care, and eventually a job helping to distribute supplies to other survivors, paying him in chocolate and canned goods. Each chocolate bar, each kind word, each gentle gesture chipped away at years of indoctrination. The children began to understand that they'd been lied to about their supposed enemies. And if they'd been lied to about Americans, what else had they been told that wasn't true? Tommy documented these interactions in letters home to his family in Iowa. He wrote about Klaus, about Greta and her brother, about Hans and dozens of other children whose worlds had been turned upside down not by American cruelty, but by American kindness. "We're not just fighting a war," Tommy wrote to his sister. "We're showing these kids that everything they've been taught about us is wrong. And maybe, just maybe, we're planting seeds for a different kind of future." The impact went beyond individual relationships. As word spread through Munich survivor networks, more children began emerging from hiding. The temporary shelter grew into a larger operation, eventually housing and feeding over 200 children. But the most significant change wasn't in the numbers, it was in the attitudes. Children who had been raised to hate Americans were now defending them to adults who still harbored suspicions. Klaus became particularly vocal, telling anyone who would listen that the Americans had saved his life, that Tommy was his friend, that the chocolate was real and freely given. The propaganda had taught these children that Americans were monsters. But personal experience was proving to be a much more powerful teacher than propaganda had ever been. The medical miracle. The transformation of hearts and minds accelerated when the American Medical Corps established a field hospital specifically for treating civilian casualties, especially children. What the children witnessed there challenged not just their beliefs about Americans, but their understanding of what enemies were supposed to do to each other. Dr. Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American Army physician, led the pediatric efforts. She had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments throughout the war, driven by a belief that healing transcended politics and nationality. When she saw the condition of Munich's children, malnourished, injured, traumatized, she knew she'd found her most important mission. Klaus was among the first children brought to Dr. Chen's field hospital. He was suffering from malnutrition, a serious respiratory infection, and an infected cut on his leg that could have led to amputation if left untreated. By all propaganda standards, the Americans should have either ignored his condition or made it worse. Instead, Dr. Chen treated Klaus with the same care she would have given an American child. She cleaned and dressed his wounds, provided antibiotics for his infection, and made sure he received proper nutrition. But more than that, she treated him with dignity and respect, explaining what she was doing, asking about his pain levels, and even teaching him some English words related to medical care. Klaus watched in amazement as Dr. Chen and her team treated dozens of children with the same careful attention. They worked around the clock, using precious medical supplies on former enemies, showing no favoritism between American casualties and civilians. Greta brought her sick brother to the hospital with pneumonia that would have been fatal without treatment. Hans arrived with a broken arm that had healed incorrectly after weeks without medical care. Little Emma, only 5 years old, came in severely malnourished and covered in infected sores. In each case, the American medical team treated these children as if they were their own family members. They used the same medicines, the same techniques, the same compassionate care that they provided to wounded American soldiers. The children began talking to each other about what they were experiencing. How could monsters be so gentle? How could enemies work so hard to heal rather than harm? How could Americans use their own medical supplies to help people they were supposed to hate? Dr. Chen noticed the psychological impact of medical care extending far beyond the physical healing. Children who arrived terrified and suspicious gradually became relaxed and trusting. They began to smile, to laugh, to play, behaviors that had been suppressed by months of survival-focused existence. Klaus became Dr. Chen's unofficial assistant, helping to translate simple German phrases and serving as a bridge between the medical team and new children who arrived fearful and uncertain. He took pride in explaining to newcomers that the Americans were there to help, not hurt. The medical care represented something profoundly important, proof that American values extended beyond nationality and politics to encompass basic human dignity. These children were learning that enemies could choose healing over harm, compassion over cruelty. The unexpected teachers. As weeks passed, an extraordinary role reversal began to take place. The children who had been rescued and cared for by American soldiers started becoming teachers themselves, helping their liberators understand the depth of propaganda they'd been subjected to and the complexity of rebuilding trust in a shattered society. Klaus, now healthy and well-fed thanks to American care, began sharing stories about his life before the war. He told Tommy about school lessons where children were taught that Americans were savage barbarians who hated all other peoples. He described propaganda films showing supposed American atrocities, and songs that depicted the United States as a nation of demons. But Klaus also shared more subtle aspects of indoctrination. How children were taught that their worth came from service to the state. How questioning authority was presented as betrayal. How loyalty was measured by willingness to hate designated enemies, even enemies they'd never met. Tommy and his fellow soldiers began to understand that they weren't just dealing with the aftermath of military defeat. They were confronting the results of systematic psychological manipulation that had shaped every aspect of these children's understanding of the world. Greta, who had been taught that American women were weak and inferior, was amazed by Dr. Chen's competence and authority. She spent hours with the doctor, learning not just about medicine but about the possibilities for women in American society. For the first time in her life, Greta began to imagine a future where she could pursue education and career goals beyond the traditional roles assigned to women in her previous world. Hans, who had been indoctrinated with beliefs about racial superiority and the natural hierarchy of peoples, found those beliefs challenged by the diversity of the American forces. He met soldiers of different ethnicities working together as equals, treating each other and their former enemies with equal respect. The children began asking questions that their American caretakers found both heartbreaking and hopeful. Why had they been told so many lies? How could they know what was true and what wasn't? What would happen to them now that their old world was gone? These conversations forced the Americans to confront their own assumptions about propaganda, education, and the responsibility that came with liberation. They realized they weren't just providing temporary relief, they were helping to shape the minds that would rebuild this society. Tommy wrote to his family about the profound responsibility he felt. "These kids are like blank slates in some ways," he explained. "Everything they thought they knew has been proven wrong. What we show them now, how we treat them, what we teach them, it's all going to influence what kind of adults they become." The unexpected lesson was that liberation involved much more than military victory. It required patience, compassion, and a willingness to demonstrate through daily actions the values that America claimed to represent. The spreading influence. The transformation occurring among Munich's children began to influence the broader civilian population as word spread through the survivor networks about American behavior. Adults who had been hiding in basements and rural areas started emerging, drawn by reports that the occupation was unlike anything they'd been prepared for. Klaus became an unlikely ambassador, accompanying Tommy on missions to find more survivors. His presence helped convince suspicious adults that the Americans could be trusted. When frightened families saw a healthy, happy German child working alongside American soldiers, it challenged their preconceptions about what conquest was supposed to look like. The ripple effects extended beyond immediate relief efforts. As children recovered their health and spirits, they began talking to any adults they encountered, relatives who emerged from hiding, neighbors returning to check on destroyed homes, strangers met in food distribution lines. These conversations had a profound impact because they came from the most vulnerable members of society. If the Americans were treating children with kindness, if they were healing rather than harming, if they were sharing rather than hoarding, then perhaps everything about this occupation was different from what propaganda had predicted. Hans, who had become fluent in basic English through his work with supply distribution, served as a translator for American efforts to communicate with adult civilians. He took pride in explaining American policies and reassuring frightened adults that the soldiers were there to help, not punish. Dr. Chen's medical work expanded to include adult patients as word spread that Americans were providing healthcare to former enemies. German civilians began arriving at the field hospital with injuries and illnesses that had gone untreated during the chaotic final months of the war. Each patient treated, each life saved, each act of medical compassion served as a refutation of everything the population had been taught about American character and intentions. The children's shelter evolved into a community center where adults could receive information about food distribution, medical care, and plans for reconstruction. Klaus and other children served as living testimonies to American intentions, proof that liberation could involve healing rather than revenge. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the children themselves, who were discovering that they had the power to influence adult opinions. For the first time in their lives, they were being listened to, their experiences valued, their insights respected. They began to understand that their voices mattered, that their perspectives were important, that they could contribute to rebuilding their society rather than simply accepting what others told them to believe. The letters home. As American soldiers witnessed the transformation occurring among Munich's children, many began writing detailed letters to their families back home, documenting experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about war, enemies, and the process of rebuilding after conflict. Tommy's letters to his family in Iowa became increasingly reflective as he processed what he was witnessing. "I came here expecting to fight enemies," he wrote. "But these kids aren't enemies. They're just children who were taught to be afraid of us. And now that they've seen who we really are, everything is changing." His sister, Mary, shared Tommy's letters with neighbors and friends in their small Iowa town. The stories of Klaus, Greta, Hans, and other children resonated with American families who were trying to understand what their sons and fathers were experiencing overseas. Dr. Chen's letters to her family in California described the medical challenges of treating children who had been subjected to months of malnutrition and poor living conditions. But she also wrote about the psychological healing that occurred when children realized they were being cared for rather than harmed. "The physical recovery is important," she explained in one letter, "but the emotional recovery is what will determine what kind of adults these children become. We're not just healing bodies, we're helping to heal minds that have been damaged by propaganda and fear." These letters began circulating through American communities, shared in churches, schools, and community organizations. They provided a perspective on the war's aftermath that went beyond military victories and political arrangements to focus on the human cost and the human potential for healing. The stories had a particular impact on American children, who could identify with kids their own age experiencing unimaginable hardships. Schools began organizing care packages for European children, and children's groups started fundraising efforts to support relief work. But the letters also challenged American assumptions about enemies and war. The children Tommy and his fellow soldiers were helping weren't faceless adversaries, they were individuals with names, personalities, dreams, and fears. They were capable of change, growth, and gratitude. The correspondence revealed that the process of liberation was transforming both the liberated and the liberators. American soldiers were learning about compassion, patience, and the complexity of human nature. They were discovering that victory could be measured not just in territory conquered, but in hearts and minds changed. The long-term impact. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the temporary children's shelter in Munich evolved into something more permanent. The American military administration, recognizing the success of the program, allocated resources for a proper orphanage and school that could provide long-term care and education for children who had lost everything. Klaus, now 9 years old and fully recovered from his malnutrition and injuries, became one of the star pupils at the new school. He was learning English rapidly and helping to teach other children. But more importantly, he was learning to think critically, to ask questions, to form his own opinions rather than simply accepting what authority figures told him. The curriculum at the American-sponsored school was deliberately designed to encourage independent thinking. Children learned about democracy, about the importance of individual rights, about the value of questioning authority and forming personal judgments based on evidence rather than propaganda. Greta, inspired by her interactions with Dr. Chen, expressed interest in studying medicine. The American administration arranged for her to receive advanced tutoring in science and mathematics, subjects that had been limited for girls under the previous system. Hans discovered a talent for languages and became fluent in English within months. He began working as a translator for American relief efforts and expressed interest in international relations and diplomacy. But the impact extended far beyond individual success stories. The children who had been cared for by American soldiers became advocates for democracy and human rights throughout their lives. They carried with them the personal experience of being treated with dignity by former enemies, and that experience shaped their understanding of how society should treat all people. As these children grew into adults, they became teachers, doctors, business leaders, and political figures who helped rebuild their society based on principles of human dignity and individual worth. They remembered the chocolate, the medical care, the patience, and the kindness, and they worked to create a society that reflected those values. Klaus eventually became a teacher himself, dedicating his life to educating young people about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of treating all people with respect regardless of their nationality or background. He never forgot Tommy Mitchell, the American soldier who had offered him chocolate and shown him that enemies could become friends. Dr. Chen's medical work continued throughout the occupation period and beyond. She established training programs that taught German medical professionals American techniques and standards of care. Her influence extended throughout the rebuilt medical system, ensuring that the principles of compassionate care regardless of nationality became embedded in professional practices. The children's shelter became a model for similar programs throughout occupied territories. The success in Munich demonstrated that liberation could be achieved through compassion as well as force, and that the treatment of children could be a key factor in rebuilding societies based on democratic principles. The transformation of hearts and minds. By the winter of 1945, the transformation that had begun with chocolate bars and medical care had spread throughout Munich and beyond. The children who had been rescued and cared for by American soldiers had become living testimonies to the possibility of former enemies becoming friends. Klaus, now comfortable speaking English, was invited to speak at American community meetings where he shared his experiences with soldiers and civilians. His stories about Tommy, Dr. Chen, and other Americans who had shown him kindness had a profound impact on audiences who were trying to understand how to build a lasting peace. The boy who had once hidden in ruins, terrified of American monsters, was now explaining to American audiences how their soldiers had saved his life and changed his understanding of the world. He spoke about the power of small gestures, the importance of treating all people with dignity, and the possibility of overcoming hatred through personal relationships. Greta, who had advanced rapidly in her medical studies with American support, began working as an assistant in the field hospital. She was learning not just medical techniques, but also the American approach to healthcare that emphasized treating all patients with equal care regardless of their background. Hans had become so proficient in English that he was working as a liaison between American administrators and German civilian leaders. His role required him to help both sides understand each other's perspectives and find common ground for rebuilding efforts. The success of the Munich program attracted attention from American policymakers who were planning long-term occupation and reconstruction strategies. The emphasis on treating former enemies with dignity and compassion, particularly children, became a model for American efforts throughout occupied territories. But the most significant impact was on the fundamental understanding of what liberation could mean. Instead of simply defeating enemies and imposing American will, the Munich experience demonstrated that liberation could involve healing, education, and the gradual transformation of societies based on demonstrated values rather than forced compliance. The children who had experienced American kindness became advocates for the principles they had witnessed. They understood democracy not as an abstract political concept, but as a practical approach to treating people with dignity and respect. As these children grew into adults, they carried forward the lessons they had learned about the possibility of former enemies becoming friends, about the importance of questioning propaganda, and about the power of individual kindness to overcome institutional hatred. The rebuilding of trust. The reconstruction of Munich proceeded faster than anyone had anticipated, largely because of the foundation of trust that had been built through the treatment of children. Families who had seen their youngest members treated with kindness by American soldiers were more willing to cooperate with Reconstruction efforts and embrace democratic reforms. Klaus's family, when they were finally located and reunited with him, were amazed by the change in their son. He was healthy, well-educated, and had learned to speak English fluently. But more importantly, he had developed confidence, critical thinking skills, and a worldview that emphasized human dignity over national superiority. The reunion was emotional but also challenging. Klaus's parents had to reconcile their own indoctrination with the evidence of American kindness demonstrated through their son's experience. The boy they had lost as a terrified, starving child had been returned to them as a healthy, confident young person with a completely different understanding of the world. Greta's reunion with distant relatives was similarly complex. She had developed aspirations and capabilities that would have been impossible under the previous system. Her dreams of studying medicine and contributing to society as an equal participant rather than a subordinate were foreign concepts to family members who had been raised with different expectations. Hans had become so integrated into American relief efforts that his role in Reconstruction was crucial for building bridges between occupying forces and civilian populations. His ability to understand both perspectives made him invaluable for resolving misunderstandings and building cooperative relationships. The American military administration recognized that the success of long-term Reconstruction depended on this kind of trust building at the individual level. Programs that emphasized caring for children, providing medical care, and demonstrating democratic values through daily actions were expanded throughout occupied territories. But the most important lesson learned was that military victory alone was insufficient for lasting peace. The transformation of former enemies into allies required patience, compassion, and a willingness to invest in relationships that went beyond immediate strategic objectives. The children who had been saved by American kindness became living bridges between former enemies, proof that hatred could be overcome through personal experience and that the values of democracy could be taught through example rather than coercion. The legacy that lasted. As the American occupation of Germany transitioned to a partnership between former enemies who had become allies, the children who had been rescued from the ruins of Munich carried forward lessons that would influence the rest of their lives and the lives of future generations. Klaus became a prominent educator who dedicated his career to teaching young people about the dangers of propaganda and the importance of international cooperation. He established exchange programs that brought American and German students together, helping them understand each other's cultures and build personal relationships that transcended national boundaries. His autobiography, published in both German and English, detailed his experiences during the war and the transformation that occurred when he encountered American soldiers who treated him with kindness rather than cruelty. The book became required reading in schools throughout Germany and was translated into multiple languages. Greta completed her medical studies and became a pioneering advocate for international medical cooperation. She established programs that brought together medical professionals from former enemy countries to share knowledge and techniques. Her work was directly inspired by Dr. Chen's example of providing care regardless of nationality. Hans pursued a career in international diplomacy, eventually becoming an ambassador who specialized in rebuilding relationships between former enemies. His unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of conflict made him extraordinarily effective at helping nations overcome historical animosities. But the impact extended far beyond individual success stories. The generation of children who had been cared for by American soldiers became leaders in building the democratic institutions that would define post-war Germany. They understood democracy not as a foreign imposition, but as a practical system for ensuring that all people were treated with dignity and respect. These children grew up to become parents who taught their own children about the importance of questioning authority, thinking critically, and treating all people as fellow human beings regardless of their nationality or background. The values they had learned through personal experience with American kindness became embedded in the culture they helped create. The chocolate bars, medical care, and patient kindness provided by American soldiers had planted seeds that grew into a society based on democratic principles and international cooperation. The investment in treating former enemies with compassion had paid dividends that lasted for generations. Dr. Chen's medical techniques and humanitarian approach influenced medical education throughout Germany. Her emphasis on treating all patients with equal care regardless of their background became a standard that shaped professional medical practice for decades. Tommy Mitchell returned to Iowa after the war, but he maintained correspondence with Klaus and other children he had helped. Their letters, exchanged over many years, documented the long-term impact of the kindness he had shown during those crucial months after liberation. The lessons that echoed through time. As Klaus, Greta, Hans, and thousands of other children who had experienced American kindness grew into adults and eventually became elders, they carried forward a profound understanding of how quickly hearts and minds could be changed when enemies chose compassion over cruelty. Klaus, in his final years, often spoke to school groups about his experiences. He would show them the wooden horse he had carried through the war, the same toy he had clutched while hiding from American monsters. Then he would tell them about Tommy Mitchell, about the chocolate bar, about the medical care, about the patience and kindness that had transformed his understanding of the world. I was taught that Americans were demons, he would tell young audiences. But when I met them, I discovered they were human beings who chose to treat a frightened child with kindness. That choice changed everything, not just for me, but for our entire society. His message was always the same: propaganda could teach hatred, but personal experience was more powerful than any indoctrination. Small acts of kindness could overcome years of conditioning. Enemies could become friends when they chose to see each other as fellow human beings. Greta's medical career included extensive work with international humanitarian organizations. She frequently spoke about how Dr. Chen's example had shaped her understanding of what medical care should represent: healing that transcended politics, nationality, and the artificial boundaries that separated people. Hans's diplomatic work focused on helping nations recover from conflicts by emphasizing the importance of treating former enemies with dignity and respect. His approach was always rooted in his personal experience of being rescued by people he had been taught to fear. Together, these former children became ambassadors for the principle that lasting peace required more than military victory. It required the transformation of hearts and minds through demonstrated compassion and respect for human dignity. Their stories became case studies in universities around the world, examples of how individuals could overcome indoctrination and how societies could be rebuilt based on democratic principles. But more importantly, their lives served as proof that the investment in treating former enemies with kindness could yield returns that lasted for generations. The Final Testament. In 2015, 70 years after the end of World War II, Klaus Brenner, now 78 years old, stood before an audience at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He was there to share his story as part of a program commemorating the American role in liberating and rebuilding Europe. He held up the same wooden horse he had carried as a frightened 8-year-old hiding in the ruins of Munich. His voice was strong despite his age, his English fluent after decades of international work as an educator and advocate for democratic values. "This toy survived the war," he said, "but I survived because of the kindness of American soldiers who could have treated me as an enemy but chose instead to treat me as a child in need of help." He spoke about Tommy Mitchell, whom he had remained friends with until the soldier's death in 2003. He talked about Dr. Chen, whose medical care had saved his life and whose example had inspired a generation of German medical professionals. He described the chocolate bar that had been his introduction to American kindness, and the profound impact of being treated with dignity by people he had been taught to hate. "The propaganda told us that Americans were monsters," Klaus continued. "But propaganda is always a lie, no matter who is speaking it. The truth can only be learned through personal experience, through individual relationships, through the choice to see others as fellow human beings rather than as enemies." The audience included American veterans who had served in the occupation forces, German exchange students studying in American universities, and young people from around the world who were learning about the importance of building bridges between former enemies. Klaus's message resonated across generations and nationalities. The most powerful weapon against hatred was not force, but kindness. The most effective way to defeat an enemy was not to destroy them, but to transform them into friends through demonstrated compassion and respect. I am here today, Klaus concluded, not because America defeated Germany in war, but because American soldiers chose to treat a frightened German child with kindness. That choice changed my life, and through my life, it helped change our entire society. He paused, looking out at the diverse audience before him. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember this: your enemy might become your friend if you treat them with the dignity that every human being deserves. And sometimes, the most important victory is not the one achieved through force, but the one achieved through love. The wooden horse that had witnessed the destruction of Munich had also witnessed its rebuilding. The child who had hidden from American monsters had grown up to become an advocate for the values those same Americans had demonstrated through their actions rather than their words. That is the story worth remembering. These children who discovered that the real battlefield wasn't between nations, but between ideologies, one that saw humans as enemies to be destroyed, and one that saw them as individuals worth protecting and nurturing, even when they had been your enemies. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. History is full of uncomfortable truths like this one, stories that challenge what we think we know about enemies and allies, about war and peace, about who the real heroes are. These stories matter because they remind us that humanity can exist even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is simple kindness extended to those who least expect it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling us what you think. And remember, the past has lessons for us if we're brave enough to listen. Sometimes the most important battles are won not with bullets and bombs, but with chocolate bars, medical care, and the radical choice to treat former enemies as future friends. Disclaimer: this video is a fictional narrative inspired by the historical setting of WW2. Characters, events, and dialogues are created for storytelling purposes and do not depict real individuals or incidents. This content is intended for entertainment and creative education only.